From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
It's a nightmare that from now on we're going to have to be living in fear every day, because TPS to us was the only form of protection that we've ever had. It's given us like a sense of peace and a sense of security, knowing that I will be able to see my parents every day when I come back home from school or work. And now that's been taken away from us.
Up to 250,000 Salvadorans could face deportation as the Trump administration ends temporary protected status, enacted in 2001. This comes as Trump says he'll only extend DACA for nearly 800,000 young dreamers if Democrats fund a border wall. Then the Reverend Dr. William Barber and others launch a new Poor People's Campaign inspired by Dr. Martin Luther King's 1968 action.
We believe that we need a sustained moral pushback that challenges the immoral public policy direction with a moral vision. I like to call it restoring moral dissent, moral dreams, and moral defibrillation.
We'll speak with Reverend William Barber, as well as evangelical minister Jonathan Wilson Hargrove, who, as a young man, worked for the pro-segregationist Senator Strom Thurmond. Today, he's organizing with Reverend Barber in what they call fusion politics. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In a major attack against immigrant communities in the United States, the Trump administration's announced it's ending temporary protected status for up to 250,000 Salvadorans who've been living in the United States since at least 2001. The temporary protected status, known as TPS, gives the Salvadorans legal permission to live and work in the United States. It was enacted in 2001 after a devastating pair of earthquakes hit El Salvador. The announcement sparked immediate protests at the White House and a news conference in New York City. This is Salvadoran TPS recipient Arania Reyes speaking here in the city.
Le rogamos a nuestro presidente Trump. We
are begging to our President Trump and to the public to stand up and ask for our permanent, not temporary, legalization. We have been in the U.S. for more than 20 years, and they didn't give us any permanent status. I think we are honorable people. We do the work other people don't want to do.
Honorables, elegibles, sacamos el trabajo que otras personas no lo quieren hacer. Ganamos muy poco.
We earn very little money. We pay for housing and taxes and school for the children, for my 3 children, and they go to the school. And today, I feel very sad because they want to take the TPS from us.
The Salvadorans will now have 18 months to leave the United States or find a legal way to remain in the U.S. The move will also affect nearly 200,000 children of Salvadoran parents who have TPS. These children are U.S. citizens. On Monday, many immigration advocates expressed concern the United States is planning to deport the Salvadorans back to a country gripped by violence and poverty, which has been exacerbated and fueled by decades of U.S. military and economic intervention in El Salvador and Central America. This is community organizer Sarah Ramirez speaking outside the protest at the White House.
Never will a physical wall stop migration, because the basis of our coming to this country is not because we thought it would be fun or because we just wanted to. It is because of situations in our countries that were historically provoked, not by us, that forced us to migrate.
Last year, the Trump administration announced it also is ending temporary protected status for tens of thousands of Haitian, Nicaraguan, and Sudanese immigrants living in the U.S. We'll have more on the Trump administration's TPS announcement after headlines. In more news on immigration, President Trump is meeting with Republican and Democratic lawmakers at the White House today to debate funding for Trump's border wall and the future of nearly 800,000 young undocumented immigrants known as Dreamers. Trump's demanding $33 billion over a decade to fund the expansion of the militarized border wall and to hire 10,000 additional immigration agents. In exchange, he's proposing Congress-authorized protections for the undocumented young people who'd been protected under DACA. That's deferred deferred action for childhood arrivals before Trump rescinded the Obama-era policy late last year. Immigrant rights groups and Democratic lawmakers have slammed Trump for trying to use the Dreamers in order to win his far-right anti-immigrant demands. White House Chief of Staff General John Kelly, formerly the Secretary of Homeland Security and before that head of Southcom, that's Southern Command, has been in charge of reaching out to lawmakers for the talks and will be at today's meeting. Over the weekend, while speaking at a press conference at Camp David, President Trump vowed there will be no resolution on DACA without billions of dollars in funding for the border wall.
We want the wall. The wall's going to happen or we're not going to have DACA.
In news from Washington, D.C., Special Counsel Robert Mueller is likely planning to interview President Trump as part of Mueller's investigation into whether the Trump campaign colluded with Russia during the 2016 election. The New York Times reports Mueller told Trump's lawyers last month he'll probably seek to interview the president, although he has not yet sent a formal request for the interview. So far, Mueller has brought charges against 4 former Trump aides, including Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort, Trump campaign advisor Rick Gates, and Trump campaign foreign policy advisor George Papadopoulos. Speculation about Oprah Winfrey potentially running for president in 2020 is continuing to build following Oprah's powerful Lifetime Achievement Award acceptance speech at the Golden Globes Sunday night. On Monday, a number of Democratic strategists came out endorsing or praising the idea. Meanwhile, President Trump's daughter and advisor, Ivanka Trump, also tweeted out a celebration of Oprah's Golden Globe speech and Hollywood's new Time's Up initiative to stop sexual harassment and violence. Ivanka tweeted, "Just saw Oprah's empowering and inspiring speech at last night's Golden Globes. Let's all come together, women and men, and say Time's Up, united," unquote. Ivanka's tweet sparked widespread criticism online, given her father, President Trump, has been accused of sexual harassment or assault or misconduct by at least 16 women. President Trump's nominee for Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services is slated to appear before the Senate Finance Committee for his confirmation hearing today. Alex Azar is a former executive of the multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly. President Trump nominated Azar to head the Health and Human Services Department after Trump's former pick, Dr. Tom Price, resigned from the position amidst a scandal over his use of military and private charter flights, which cost taxpayers up to $1 million. On Monday, Politico reported that when Alex Azar was a top executive at the drug company Eli Lilly, it tested the company's highly profitable erectile dysfunction drug Cialis on children in efforts to extend a multi-billion-dollar patent that was soon to expire. Critics say Azar helped the company game the patent system, testing a sex drug on children in order to extend Eli Lilly's profits. Officials from North and South Korea met today in the demilitarized zone for the first high-level talks in more than 2 years, amidst rising tensions on the Korean peninsula, largely sparked by President Trump's repeated threats to launch a nuclear strike against North Korea. During the meeting, North Korea said it would send a delegation of athletes, officials, and cheerleaders to the 2018 Winter Olympic Games in Pyeongchang, South Korea, in February. The two countries will also reinstate a military hotline that was suspended for nearly 2 years. In Tunisia, anti-austerity protests are spreading across the country after the government announced it's raising taxes and hiking fuel prices. At least one protester was killed and 5 others injured amidst a police crackdown against the protests Monday. The Tunisian Interior Ministry says the 55-year-old protester likely died after inhaling tear gas. In Turkey, the deputy prime minister has announced the state of emergency imposed after a July 2016 failed coup attempt will be extended for another 3 months.
The state of emergency will be extended again. As you know, as a procedure, the National Security Council needs to take an advisory decision, and then this must be discussed in the cabinet meeting. Probably this will be on the agenda during the next meeting of the National Security Council.
Activists say the Turkish government has used the failed military coup and the state of emergency to enact a far-reaching crackdown against dissidents, journalists, teachers, intellectuals, human rights activists, opposition lawmakers, and Kurdish communities in Turkey. Back in the United States, in an unexpected move, the Republican-controlled Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has rejected the Trump administration's proposal to bolster coal-fired and nuclear power plants. Trump has repeatedly promised to bolster coal production and the number of coal jobs in the United States, but his plan to do so, which was outlined last fall by Energy Secretary Rick Perry, has faced widespread opposition from not only environmentalists, but also a wide array of corporate interests, including Dow Chemical and Koch Industries. Multiple former Energy Commission chairs have also criticized the plan, saying it would raise electricity prices across the Northeast and Midwest. In Alabama, residents have raised more than $150,000 to support Tina Johnson, whose home was burned to the ground only months after she came forward to publicly accuse Alabama Republican Senate candidate Roy Moore of groping her without her consent back in 1991. The destruction of Johnson's home on January 3rd is being investigated as possible arson. Johnson says she suspects the fire is connected to her decision to come forward about her experiences with Roy Moore, who lost December's highly controversial special Senate election after at least 9 women, including Johnson, came forward to accuse him of sexually harassing or assaulting them when they were teenagers, one as young as 14 years old. In Washington, D.C., members of the LGBT community are speaking out about the brutal murder of a young African-American lesbian named Karis Lewis. The 23-year-old woman was shot and burned alive in the trunk of a car on December 28th in one of the final homicides of last year. After minimal media coverage of the possible hate crime, residents and activists took to Twitter using the hashtag #SayHerName to mourn the death of Karis Lewis. And in Harlem, hundreds of people attended the funeral of anti-police brutality activist Erica Garner, who died at the age of 27 on December 30th after an asthma-induced heart attack 4 months after giving birth to her second child. Erica's father, Eric Garner, was killed when police officers in Staten Island wrestled him to the ground, applied a fatal chokehold in 2014. Inside the church last night, Erica was eulogized by the Reverend Al Sharpton, who talked about Erica's unflinching determination to get justice for her father. Sharpton said, while they say she died of a heart attack, no, her heart was attacked that day, referring to July 27, 2014, the day police killed her father. Sharpton went on to say justice is in a coma in the Eric Garner case. The police officer, Daniel Pantaleo, who put Garner in the fatal chokehold, still works in the NYPD. There have also been no federal civil rights charges brought against him and others responsible for Eric Garner's death. Also attending the funeral, hip-hop artist and actor Carmen, and the father of Michael Brown, killed by a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, 2 weeks after Eric Garner was killed in Staten Island. There was conflict in the midst of the funeral last night over the exclusion of Erica's grandmother, Eric Garner's mother, Gwen Carr, causing a number of people to leave, including a group of mothers of children killed by New York police, like Kadiatou Diallo, the mother of Amadou Diallo. A number of New York police officers escorted Erica's coffin out of the church. After the funeral, several dozen Black Lives Matter activists took to the streets. One person was arrested. Before they marched, I spoke to QB of Shut It Down NYC, a friend of Erica Garner.
Every Tuesday and Thursday, she would do a rally, whether it was 9 degrees, 10 degrees, whether it was 3 people, 4 people, we marched. We marched to her father's memorial. We said a few words, and that was something that just became a part of our lives. That's just a unique situation where you have to grow up in front of the world. It's like the world saw your father get murdered, the world watched your father not get justice, and then you're pushed into the limelight, and you're basically living a life that you didn't ask for. And she didn't ask to be an activist. It was kind of a choice that was made for her. She was demanding what we were all demanding, which is why Pantaleo to be fired, even though he's still collecting a salary.
The officer who put
That's the
her
officer
father
who ultimately killed her, who murdered her father, and he's still actively working with NYPD. There's no justice, and there still isn't justice. And just to have NYPD at her funeral, that's the last thing in this world that she would have wanted. To have NYPD come in the church, to be involved in the funeral. But one thing I want her to be remembered is how much she loved her children, because nobody's thinking about that. She just had a 3-month-old, She had an 8-year-old Alyssa. She loved those 2 kids. She loved them for the world. And I want people to just remember that, you know, she wanted justice, she never got it, and she died never getting it. But the fight is not over. It's not over.
What do we want? Justice! What do we want? Now! What do we want? Justice! What do we want? Now! If we don't get it, shut it down!
We're standing right near the church where Eric Garner was just memorialized, and police are arresting one of the protesters outside.
Back up.
The man is still being paid who murdered Eric Garner. Please keep that in mind. That man is still on salary with the NYPD, and his daughter is now dead. Show some respect for the dead. That's Valerie Ross, one of scores of protesters who took to the streets after the funeral of Erica Garner. She will be laid to rest today in Linden, New Jersey. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We turn now to look at the battle over immigration in Washington. President Trump is meeting with Republican and Democratic lawmakers at the White House today over his offer to protect the nearly 800,000 young undocumented immigrants known as Dreamers in exchange for $18 billion to build a border wall. The meeting comes one day after the Trump administration announced it's ending the temporary protected status for as many as 250,000 Salvadorans who've been living in the U.S. since 2001. The temporary status, known as TPS, had given the Salvadorans legal permission to live and work in the United States, enacted in 2001 after a devastating pair of earthquakes hit El Salvador. The announcement sparked immediate protest outside the White House and in several cities. Here in New York, Salvadoran TPS recipient Reyes spoke at a news conference.
Le rogamos a nuestro presidente Trump y el público queremos.
We are begging to our President Trump and to the public to stand up and ask for our permanent, not temporary, legalization. We have been in the U.S. for more than 20 years, and they didn't give us any permanent status. I think we are honorable people. We do the work other people don't want to do.
Honorables, elegibles, sacamos el trabajo que otras personas no lo quieren hacer. Ganamos muy poco.
We earn very little money. We pay for housing and taxes and school for the children, for my 3 children, and they go to the school. And today, I feel very sad because they want to take the TPS from us. The people who brought our children here with us and who brought them here when they were young, it's not their fault, it's our fault. We were looking for an improvement after our country was destroyed by war. And after that, in 2001, it was destroyed by the earthquake on January 13th, 2001. I hope they give us legal status. That's what we are asking. We are honorable people, worthy of this country. And this country is our country because we spend our lives here.
The Trump administration's already said it'll end temporary protected status for tens of thousands of Haitian, Nicaraguan, and Sudanese immigrants living in the U.S. For more, we're joined by 2 guests. Rodman is a student at Stony Brook University in Long Island, New York, a member of Make the Road New York. He's a U.S. citizen whose parents are Salvadoran temporary protected status recipients. He asked us not to use his last name to protect his family. And we're joined by Anu Joshi, who is Immigration Policy Director at the New York Immigration Coalition. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Rodman, let's begin with you. Tell us about your family. What will happen? Were you surprised by President Trump's announcement yesterday?
Well, thank you so much for having me on your program. I am the son of 2 immigrant parents from El Salvador. My mom and my dad both have TPS. They've been living on Long Island for the past 25 years. My parents, my 2 sisters and me, we consider ourselves all to be Long Islanders because that's where our home is. That's where we've been going to church, to school. Everyone we know is from Long Island. So the news that we received, the announcement yesterday, was absolutely devastating. I think we were kind of anticipating it. So for the past few months, we've been living in a state of fear and anxiety. But actually hearing the news it's a nightmare for us.
What does it mean?
To us, it means that our sense of protection, our sense of security, all of that is going to vanish.
Your parents would be sent back in 18 months?
That risk is, it's very possible. It's very possible that my two parents who've been living here since the early 1990s, who've been working, contributing here, on Long Island, it's very possible that they're going to be sent back to a country that they haven't visited in over 20 years. So
what would happen to the three of you? You're all U.S. citizens?
Yes, so I was born here, so was my two sisters were also born here. We depend so much on our parents for not only financial support, but also emotional support. I think a lot of the things that me and my sisters are able to accomplish in life, whether it's school or work, it's because of all the support that our parents have given us. And I'm very thankful for not only all the sacrifices that they've made, but also the examples that they've set for us. They are my role models, and I think they've given us the tools that makes us become very responsible.
And temporary protected status was extended to your parents because of the earthquakes? Because of what happened in El Salvador?
Yeah, so my two parents, they left in the early 1990s, before the earthquake, but they left during the Civil War. So they were escaping the Civil War. El Salvador is a country where there's no real job opportunities, where there's no real stability, and where there's corruption. So they escaped in the early 1990s. And in 2001, there was a devastating earthquake that devastated the entire country. So they came to this country seeking stability, seeking a better future for themselves and their family, pursuing the American dream. And to them, the American dream is that me and my two sisters will be able to get an education and move ahead in life.
Anu Joshi, can you talk about what this means for 250,000 people? And then we've got to extend the number by, what, another 200,000, the American kids like Rodman?
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. So, as you mentioned, this administration already terminated TPS for Sudan, Nicaragua, and Haiti, Haiti being the next largest population at 50,000, many of whom live here in New York. But for the people like Rodman's parents and hundreds of thousands of people like Rodman's parents across the country, this means that in 18 months, the businesses that they've started are going to shutter. The companies where they work are going to lose employees. The places, the federal government, the states, the local taxes they pay are no longer going to be paid. The mortgages they own, the houses that they own, almost a third of Salvadorans with TPS own their home or have a mortgage, are not going to be paid. And these people who are completely integrated into American society, have been here for over 2 decades, many of them, are going to be pushed into the shadows. And it's really unconscionable what this administration is doing. And I think with these 4 decisions and the attack and termination of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, we've seen that this administration is really pursuing an aggressive, extremist attack on immigrants and all communities of color.
Salvadorans have been major labor organizers as well. Do you see this as an attack on the labor community?
100%. Yesterday we had a press conference, and we had a SCIU 32BJ member who is a housekeeper on Long Island, who's been a member for over 15 years. We had a cook from Unite Here who has worked at the same restaurant for 17 years, and he's worked his way up. He started as a dishwasher, and now he's a cook. And he's at TPS. He has 2 children. This is an attack on labor. This is an attack on working people. It's also an attack on people who have started businesses and raised families.
Let me go to Rodriguez, a Salvadoran beneficiary of temporary protected status, who spoke at Monday's news conference in New York.
We have one foot here and the other in our republic, El Salvador. And even though my heart is always there in that country, for me, living here, as my predecessor said, is a matter of life and death, because we cannot go back to our country. There are a lot of compatriots that have tried it, and have tried to start a business, to start a life there, and they haven't been able to do it because of the evil our country is suffering. President Trump and the politicians do not know who the beneficiaries of temporary protected status are. We are not gang members. We are not criminals. We are people that, as the majority of the people who live here, we came following a dream, an American dream, a dream that, sadly, we cannot have in our countries, but it was possible here. We achieve it thanks to our work.
Your response?
I mean, I don't understand how anyone could look at that and say that that's someone that's not contributing to our society. You know, everything that this administration is doing is not about keeping our country safe or making this country greater. It's about making our country worse by trying to push into the shadows or worse, deport people like Hugo who are just, you know, raising their families and making a living.
Robin, we're not using your last name to protect your family, but you mentioned the Civil War, which often people do not refer to as a civil war in Salvador because the studies show overwhelmingly it was the U.S.-backed military government and paramilitaries that were killing off the majority of people, as happened in Nicaragua, the illegal war in Nicaragua when it came to the Contras. The U.S. was not supposed to be supporting the Contras, but was getting around various laws like the Boland Amendment. Can you talk about this? As my colleague Juan Gonzalez wrote a book called Harvest of Empire, people fleeing, sadly, U.S.-connected violence in their countries, and then when they get here, being told they have to go back.
And to that point, the creation of the Temporary Protected Status Program was in response to the U.S. involvement in El Salvador in the early 90s. And so it was a recognition by our government that we had created a part of this problem, and we needed to provide safe haven. We needed to protect these people. We could not send them back into that violence. And if you look at El Salvador as a country right now, it has the third highest homicide rate in the world. It's considered the most violent country that's not currently in a war zone by the United Nations. 17% of its GDP comes from remittances from the United States. And if you try to send or repatriate hundreds of thousands of people into a country where has weak government institutions, where violence is rampant, where gangs are conscripting youth, you know, every day, it's going to destabilize the region, and that's not going to be good for the United States either.
I wanted to put this in the larger context right now of what's happening in the White House. You have President Trump meeting with Democrats and Republicans, and this is led, and this is not often the case, by the Chief of Staff, this meeting, General Kelly. General Kelly, who before being Chief of Staff of President Trump was head of Department of Homeland Security, and before that in charge of Southcom, Southern Command. Can you talk about the significance of Trump saying this weekend at Camp David that it is DACA and the wall or no DACA?
Well, and let's be clear, he didn't just say DACA and the wall. He also said, and additional CBP agents, and an end to the diversity.
Customs and Border Patrol.
Sorry, Customs and Border Patrol agents, and to the diversity visa, ending family reunification, which has been the cornerstone of our immigration policy for decades, since the 1960s. So he laid out a laundry list of the most extremist anti-immigrant agenda in exchange for 800,000 young people, you know, which is a situation that he created when he terminated DACA in September. You know, we're telling Senator Schumer here in New York and the Democrats in both sides of the House and the Senate that they need to stand strong against this, that this is a wish list that is not a wish list at all. I don't even know what it is. This is not in good faith.
And do you have confidence in the Democrats?
Maybe. I hope so.
Rodman, is your university, Stony Brook on Long Island, part of the State University of New York system, an esteemed university around the country standing up for you and other students who have temporary protected status themselves, or in your case, your parents?
So a group of a group of students, we have started a club trying to push our administrators from Stony Brook to adopt policies that would benefit students not only who have DACA, who are losing their DACA statuses every day, but also for parents, for students whose parents have TPS. Because, for example, like I sometimes depend on my parents for financial support to pay my tuition. And once once
Sounds
TPS
like
is
that's
gone.
in New York's interest.
It is,
that
yeah,
your tuition is paid.
Yeah, we really depend on our administrators, but also our local and state representatives to become advocates for us and to really push for legislation that's going to benefit people like me and my family. I think that investing more money into ICE agents or having the local police department collaborate with immigration, I think it's misguided. And if we need our representatives to really push for permanent legislation, like permanent residency for my parents. I think once you really invest in communities, or like my community and my family, it's one of the best ways that you can really uplift this country. And how are Salvadorans in Long Island organizing? Okay, so this news has affected everyone from where I come from on Long Island. Long Island has a large Salvadorian and also Haitian population. So everyone is pretty much really in a state of panic. So what people are doing is that they're getting informed. I'm part of a community organization called Make the Road New York. We're doing workshops. We're holding Know Your Rights workshops. And we're also telling, people like me, like youth like me who are citizens, that we have a lot of power. Once we share our stories, we can make a difference. And also, we have lots of voting power. So it's very important for us to get organized, to know our rights, to stand up for our parents. Our parents have always been there for us. So it's time now. It's really urgent that we stand up for them. Well, I want to thank you both for being with us. Rodman, I hope soon to be able to say your whole name. But while you feel your family is vulnerable, we'll stick with your first name. Rodman, a U.S. citizen, a student at Stony Brook University in Stony Brook, Long Island, New York, whose parents are Salvadoran temporary protected status recipients. And Anu Joshi, Immigration Policy Director at the New York Immigration Coalition. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, a new Poor People's March, an unusual coalition. We'll be joined by the Reverend William Barber, as well as an evangelical minister who worked for the segregationist presidential candidate, longtime Senator Strom Thurmond, now joining in a Poor People's March. Stay with us.
And you can only you with what you got. You don't have to pretend that you gotta know more, 'cause you are young, Latin, and proud. Young, Latin, and proud. Young, Latin, and proud. Young, Latin, and proud. 'Cause you woke up feeling like this. You woke up knowing that you'll be you for the rest of your life, for the rest of your life. 'Cause you are young, Latin, and proud. Young, Latin, and proud. Young, Latin, and proud. Young, Latin, and proud. And we are young, Latin, and proud. Young, Latin, and proud. Young, Latin, and proud. We are young, Latin, and proud. And you grow older knowing that you'll always be this one thing, and you always have this to be you. The people who be here waiting for you always will be one with you, and you'll be one with me. Young, Latin, and proud. Young, Latin, and proud. Young, Latin, and proud. Young, Latin, and proud. Tu abuela es young, Latin, and proud. Tu tía son young, Latin, and proud. Tu hermana es young, Latin, and proud. Tu tío son young, Latin, and proud. Young, Latin, and proud. One day you'll be old, Latin, and proud. Old, Latin, and proud. Young, Latin, and proud. And you can only
Latin and Proud by Helado Negro, or Black Ice Cream, performing here in our Democracy Now! Studios. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As the nation prepares to mark Martin Luther King Day next Monday, modern-day civil rights leaders have launched a new Poor People's campaign inspired by the historic 1968 action 50 years ago led by King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
Millions of young people grow up in the sunlight of opportunity. But that is another America. And this other America has a daily ugliness about it that transforms the buoyancy of hope into the fatigue of despair. In this other America, millions of people find themselves walking the streets in search for jobs that do not exist.
That was Dr. Martin Luther King speaking about the 1968 Poor People's Campaign. In the coming months, organizers are planning 6 weeks of direct action at state houses across the country and the U.S. Capitol to call attention to systemic racism, poverty, the war, economy, and ecological devastation. We're joined by two of the organizers of the campaign, Reverend Dr. William Barber, President and Senior Lecturer of Repairers of the Breach, leader of the Moral Mondays and author of Third Reconstruction, Moral Mondays, Fusion Politics, and the Rise of a New Justice Movement. We're also joined by Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, an evangelical minister and director of the School for Conversion in Durham, North Carolina. He's author of the upcoming book, Reconstructing the Gospel, Finding Freedom from Slaveholder Religion. While the two men have organized together for years, they were not always in political agreement. Barber grew up in the Black-led freedom movement. Wilson Hartgrove grew up as a white Southern Baptist, served as a page for the late South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond, a fierce foe of the civil rights movement, a supporter of segregation. Wilson Hartgrove's political transition began after hearing Reverend Barber preach. Well, we welcome you both to Democracy Now! Reverend Barber, talk about the significance of Dr. King Day and your launch of the Poor People's March 50 days after his, 50 years after his.
Well, thank you so much, Amy. In January, on the 5th of January, we actually launched after traveling to 15 states doing regional trainings, organizing 1,000 people in 25 states, District of Columbia, that have committed to do direct action, civil disobedience, training, preparing for voter registration, to launch a movement. We have black, we have white, we have brown, young, old, gay, straight, Jewish, Muslim, Christians, people of faith, people not of faith, who are coming together. 50 years later, Amy, and one of the things we're doing is we're writing something called The Souls of Poor Folk, Auditing America, 50 years later. IPS, Institute for Policy Studies, is helping with activists and impacted people.
Referencing W.E.B. Du Bois.
W.E.B. Du Bois, that's right. And to talk about the souls of poor folk, because so often the poor are just dismissed. Both parties, we don't even talk about the poor. We talk middle class, working class, not the poor. So 50 years later, we have nearly 100 million poor and working poor people in this country, 14 million poor children. 50 years later, we have less voting rights protection than we had in August 6, 1965. 50 years later, Strom Thurmond, for instance, filibustered the Civil Rights Act of '57 for a day. Ryan, McConnell, and Boehner have filibustered fixing the Voting Rights Act now for over 4 years, over 1,700 days. We have tremendous ecological devastation. And when we look at, for instance, systemic voter suppression, and you map it, we've done some maps. Every state where there's high voter suppression, it also high poverty, denial of health care, denial of living wages, denial of labor union rights, attacks on immigrants, attacks on women. So it's the same states, and what was happening, this is not for the poor, it's with the poor, and it's launching a multi-year campaign that we're beginning now.
I want to ask you, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, about your life story. I mean, for young people, they may not have even heard of Strom Thurmond, one of the longest-serving senators in U.S. history, also ran for president on a segregationist platform. What was your involvement with him?
Well, that was 1948, and I was born in 1980, so I wasn't, very aware of that either growing up. I grew up in a Southern Baptist culture that told us, if you're faithful, you're Republican. And I wanted to do all that I could for Jesus, so I was trying to make it to the White House, and Jesse Helms referred me to Strom Thurmond, and that's how I ended up in his office. But when I got there, I began to realize that something wasn't quite right in terms of these values that I was taught of love and justice and concern for the community, and what was happening there, which was really about holding on to power. And I began to realize, you know, what Reverend Barber was saying, that my people in North Carolina and in the South had really been duped. That we were told that this was good for us and good for America and good for the world, and as a matter of fact, that they were using religion to serve this white supremacist agenda that really wasn't very different from what he had advocated in '48 or in the '50s and the '60s, but had changed its language a bit. And so I was very grateful for Reverend Barber teaching me that freedom movement history, beginning to realize that there really has been a movement that has pushed for an inclusive democracy in this country since the 19th century, and that effort to reconstruct this country is also very faith-rooted, and we connected because of our faith and began to realize that there were some faith leaders who were using that faith to serve the agenda of this really white supremacy campaign.
Did you understand this when you were a page for Senator Thurmond?
No, I was very confused. That's why I needed a teacher like Dr. Barber here.
Did you ever confront Senator Thurmond as you came to understand and believe in a different path?
No, he was in his 90s, and I don't think was very open to confrontation. The only serious conversation he ever had with me was telling me when I got to D.C. as a 16-year-old young white man from North Carolina that I ought to be careful because this is a dangerous town. See, that's the way race was talked about in that movement. Still is. Right?
Let me play a clip of your senator, Senator Strom Thurmond, speaking in 1948 when he ran for president as a nominee of the pro-segregationist States' Rights Democratic Party, more popularly known as the Dixiecrats. Thurmond spoke out against Harry Truman's civil rights platform at the time.
It simply means that it's another effort on the part of the president to dominate the country by force and to put into effect these uncalled for and these damnable proposals he has recommended under the guise of so-called civil rights. And I tell you, the American people from one side or the other had better wake up and oppose such a program. And if they don't, the next thing will be a totalitarian state in these United States.
Needless to say, he didn't win in 1948, but that philosophy of segregation carried on. As you watched what happened in Virginia, in Charlottesville this past summer, did you see the echoes of Strom Thurmond as the self-proclaimed fascists, the self-proclaimed white supremacists marched across the university?
Absolutely, because if you listen to something like that as somebody who grew up in the church, you realize that what he's doing there is preaching. He's preaching in the public square. And that's what folks like Richard Spencer are trying to do. They're trying to bring a vision for
who organize that march,
for what they want the world to be into the public square, and they're using religion to do it. And so I had to learn that whiteness is a religion that people are sold on, and that someone like me who wants to follow Jesus needs to be converted from the religion of whiteness to the religion of Jesus, or many other traditions that are willing to embrace a kind of universal humanity that whiteness can't embrace.
And how do your compatriots respond to your gospel, to what you preach now as a minister?
Well, you know, I think a lot of times when it's framed as something against what people are doing, they react, right? Everybody's defensive when you attack what they are. But when you hold forth the invitation to be part of something, you know, this Poor People's Campaign that we're talking about now is a movement that is for everyone. You know, Sister Mashyla, who was with us in D.C., came from Washington. She said, I'm the white trash that they threw out and forgot to burn. But I'm glad to be part of a movement that includes me, right? And I'm part of that movement too. So I think the constructive vision of the movement is an invitation that many people are beginning to respond to, because they you know, if you're a poor person in North Carolina or Alabama, what you have to realize at the end of the day is that these people who say vote for me because I'm a good Christian leader are not serving your interests. You don't have health care, you don't have a living wage, because the same people who say they're standing up for God and righteousness are, when they're voting against the interest of poor people, whether you're black, white, brown, or whatever.
Let me ask you something. In the Roy Moore race, yes, he was defeated. But as someone tweeted out that night when it was even closer on December 12th, if we can beat a pedophile by 0.8%, we can do anything. That was the tweet. And Reverend Barber, if we can beat a pedophile by 0.8%, we can do anything. You know, obviously a sarcastic comment. How could it possibly have been that close? And now we see the home of Tina Johnson burned to the ground in Alabama as people raise money for her, one of Roy Moore's accusers.
Well, Amy, I think Jonathan hit on something, and that is, it is important for us to remember that the movement for justice has always been biracial. The abolition movement was biracial. The civil rights movement was biracial. Triracial sometimes. The first Poor People's Campaign was not just Dr. King, it was Cesar Chavez, it was Jewish, it was the welfare workers, rights workers, it was Al McShirley who had organized up in Kentucky. In some sense, we lost that sense of fusion politics, and that's what Moral Monday has been about. That's what this Poor People's Campaign is about. Not only can we beat a pedophile, the reality is, if we focus on policy, we went to Alabama and they said we couldn't organize white ministers to stand up against Roy Moore, not about what he had allegedly done to children, but his policies. And we did. 65% of the people that got arrested Moral Monday were white on policy.
Moral Mondays meaning in North Carolina,
that's
where
right,
you are.
Where we were, where I am now. What we're saying is, do you have health care? You know, when all the southern states denied health care, the people who got elected by voter suppression didn't use that power to deny health care. The majority of the people that are being denied are white. When you don't have a living wage, the majority of the people that are being affected are white in raw numbers. There are 8 million more white people poor than there are African Americans. We have got to show how people are being played. And you can't always look just at a Charlottesville or a Strom Thurmond. Remember, they changed that language after '68. See, Kevin Phillips said, we can't talk like that anymore. What we're going to talk about now is tax cuts and entitlement cuts and forced busing. That's the language of the Southern strategy. It changed, but it was the language, it was coded language to say, number one, this is what needs to change for your life to be better. The policies are going to hurt mostly black people and brown people in a percentage basis, but it's also going to make people think that black people are the problem. That's why Trump went to an all-white audience and then talked about black people. You know, what do they have to lose? One of the things I think that's why this movement, we're saying we need a Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival. We need to reshift the moral narrative. For instance, in this week, King Week, I've been looking at how people are focusing now on Trump's quote-unquote mental status. I think that's the wrong thing. I mean, I have my own opinions about that. But Dr. King talked about America being sick. See, what we're talking about an individual, we should be examining that tax policy. We should be going down the list, every media station, and looking at how are these policies that these senators and others pass impacting the poor. Even the Democrats didn't talk much about the poor in those states. We should be talking about the judges he's trying to put on the quietly, like the one out of North Carolina, Tom Farr, he's trying to put on the bench. But the senators are helping. He's not doing this stuff by himself. If we get fixated on a person, rather than do what Dr. King said, examine the societal moral crisis that creates characters like a Trump, all right, that empowers them, then we're really in trouble. And we have to deal with the sickness of the society. Dr. King said, lastly, any society that puts more money in war than it does in social uplift is headed towards spiritual death. When we have an exacerbation of racist racism, systemic racism through voter suppression, we have extreme poverty, we have ecological devastation and a war economy and a mixed up moral narrative where people can literally run for office, Amy, and look you in the face. If you elect me, I'm going to take your health care. and get elected. If you elect me, I'm going to be a racist. If you elect me, I'm going to put hundreds of thousands of people out of the country. If you elect me, I'm going to attack 800,000 students, DACA students. And say that boldly, we have more than a personality problem. We have a moral crisis, and the only thing that can combat that is a movement that challenges that crisis.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. You're listening to the Reverend Dr. William Barber of Repairers of the Breach, up from North Carolina, and Minister Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove of the School for Conversion in North Carolina. This is Democracy Now! They're starting a Poor People's March 50 years after Dr. King's. Stay with us.
When I get older, I will be stronger. They'll call me freedom, just like a waving flag. Born to a throne, stronger than Rome, but violent prone, poor people's zone. But it's my home, all I have known, where I got grown. Streets we would roam, out of the darkness, I came the farthest, among the hardest. Survival, learn from these streets, it can be bleak, accept no defeat, surrender, retreat. So we struggling, fighting to eat, and we wondering when we'll be free. So we patiently wait for that fateful day. It's not far away, but for now we say, when I get older, I will be stronger. They'll call me freedom, just like a waving flag. And then it goes back, and then it goes back, and then it goes back, and then it goes, when I get older, I will be stronger.
Wavin' Flag by Kanan, performing here in our Democracy Now! Studios back in 2010. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As the nation prepares to honor Martin Luther King on Dr. Martin Luther King Day on Monday, modern-day civil rights leaders have launched a new Poor People's campaign inspired by King's historic 1968 action, led by King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We're speaking to the Reverend Dr. William Barber of Repairers of the Breach and evangelical minister Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, who once was a page for Strom Thurmond. Now, the man who replaced Senator Strom Thurmond from South Carolina is Republican Senator Lindsey Graham. This is what Lindsey Graham had to say when he appeared on ABC's The View on Monday.
He beat me like a drum. He ran against 17 Republicans and crushed us all. He ran against the Clinton machine and won.
Yeah.
So all I can say is you can say anything you want to say about the guy. I said he was a xenophobic, race-baiting, religious bigot. I ran out of things to say. He won. Guess what? He's our president.
You're calling him a xenophobic, religious bigot?
I did that during the campaign.
Yeah, you did.
I did.
Has he done anything to change? By the way, is he still all those things?
In my view, he is my president and is doing a really good job.
Very interesting what Senator Lindsey Graham had to say. We're joined again by Dr. William Barber and Minister Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove. Your thoughts?
Yeah, and I'm sitting here thinking, I want to just mention first Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, who's the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. She's probably looking at that and like me saying, what in the world? So you say that's during the campaign, and you laugh about it. And now the person is in office, and you say they're doing a good job. And they've neither repented in word or in deed. And in fact, their policies are finding that, and you're supporting the policy. So here's the question. If you're supporting the policies of a racist, xenophobic, what does that make you? And that's why we have to have a policy focus. Remember, it was Lindsey Graham, I believe, and others who came out quickly, Tim Scott, against what happened in Charlottesville. And most politicians will be shrewd enough to do that. That doesn't mean they aren't white supremacists and white nationalists. The question is, Mr. Graham, Mr. Scott, who's black, because you can be black and be a white supremacist. At least you can be a one who encourages it, and I think you can be in policy. Where do you stand on restoring the Voting Rights Act? You've had 4 years to do that. You do know that undermining the Voting Rights Act is white nationalism, white supremacy. Where do you stand on health care? Because you do know that when you cut health care, you hurt a large percentage of African Americans, particularly in your state. Where do you stand on living wages, since 52% of African Americans make less than a living wage, and there's 64 million people that make less than a living wage in this country, less than $15 an hour? Where do you stand on immigration reform? Because you know Richard Spencer declares that immigration is the first battle of white supremacists and white nationalists in the modern era. That's what he has actually said. So the question becomes not, are you loud like Trump, and do you carry on the antics of Trump? It's the policies. It's the policies of white nationalism and white supremacy. And with Mr. Graham, where do you stand on appointing Jeff Sessions, who has a history of standing against voting rights and trying to prosecute people fighting for voting rights? Where do you stand? Your committee, Mr. Graham, the committee you're on, allowed Thomas Farr to come through out of North Carolina to almost make it to the federal bench, who is a known Nazi sympathizer and also a white supremacist who carried the work of Jesse Helms, and who has been behind every voter suppression act in North Carolina. So talk about Thomas Alvin Farr. You also wrote about him in his New York Times op-ed piece, one of Trump's, what you called worrisome nominees to the judiciary. Well, and I want to step back from Trump, because I'm trying to work on that. I think we're too Trumpy. So yes, in the article I did say Trump, but I also pointed out, and some people missed this, Thomas Farr would have never gotten to the judiciary if it wasn't for Senator Richard Burr and Senator Tillis from our state. By the way, Senator Tillis was the architect of the voter suppression when he was Speaker of the House, who denied 2 black women, a former Supreme Court justice in North Carolina and a federal prosecutor in North Carolina. They denied them even getting a hearing. And the artists, they didn't even allow them to get a hearing. And then once Trump gets in, they push forward Farr's name. So we can't just lay this reality of what we're seeing at the feet of Trump. Trump is a symptom of a deeper moral malady. And if he was gone tomorrow or impeached tomorrow, the senators and the House of Representatives and Ryan and McConnell and Graham and all of them would still be there. And what we have found, Amy, when we look at them, no matter how crazy they call him or names they call him or anger they get with him, it's all a front, because at the end of the day, they might disagree with his antics, but they support his agenda. I wanted to turn to something that happened that might have surprised a number of people last week, and that was President Trump abruptly shutting down the Advisory Commission on Election Integrity after it failed to prove any, after it failed to provide any evidence of voter fraud. The commission's chair, Chris Kobach, blamed a, quote, barrage of meritless lawsuits for the investigation's closure after most U.S. states and the District of Columbia refused to share data with the commission. Can you talk about the, I mean, is this a victory? No, well, no, it is and it isn't. And it shouldn't. The claim of fraud is fraudulent in itself. I mean, the first thing that the Trump administration did with Jeff Sessions is pull out supporting a case out of North Carolina that the Supreme Court unanimously said was surgical racism. Now think about that. The first thing his AG appointee does is say, I'm no longer going to protect voting rights. So he's turned the Attorney General's office away from protecting voting rights. Then we have this fraudulent. We have 60 seconds. Okay, we have this fraudulent committee, and they now shut it down. But it's done its job. They're playing to a certain base. They have sown the theory of voter fraud, and that is saying they couldn't prove it because the lawsuits blocked them. It's all a game, and we have to unpack it, and we need a movement to do that. And so how are you moving that movement forward, Minister Hargrove? I think what's really important with this Poor People's Campaign is that it's local groups all over the country who are coming together, people who are impacted by these issues, realizing that the folks in Washington are not serving them. And so what we can learn from Dr. King and from that whole movement 50 years ago is that a diverse fusion coalition of people coming together and insisting on changing the priorities is what changes the country. We can't look for moral leadership from Washington. We got to get it from the ground. And the first action, 10 seconds? First action will be on the Monday after Mother's Day. We're going after 25,000 people engaging in civil disobedience over 6 weeks. to launch a movement. I want to say that, to launch the movement, not end the movement. We'll come back and talk more about it in days to come.
Reverend Dr. William Barber of Repairers of the Breach and Evangelical Minister Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, School for Conversion in North Carolina, organizing a new Poor People's Campaign, and that does it for our show. Democracy Now! Welcomes back Mike Burke from paternity leave. Thank you so much to Renee Feltz, who filled in so well. Dina Guzder, Noreen Shea, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.